Good morning, Dr. Nageswaran. Welcome as Chief Economic Advisor. Welcome to India. And we look forward to a nice tenure from you after another very significant tenure of your predecessor. This economic survey was not written by you, but I think you oversaw the whole thing, the making of it, or at least you were part of the release team. It's been a great survey, and we look forward to more.
About the pandemic risk itself, I think on balance, while acknowledging the difficulties that as a country and our citizens faced in the last 1.5 to 2 years, there are many countries that followed the zero COVID response and they are now struggling. So in fact, when the final verdict of COVID management is returned, hopefully it will be returned soon this year and not much later, because we hope that there is no other further wave or flash floods, as RBI put it. I think the fact is that given all the challenges that we have, given our developing country status, further waves to face, but the challenges that the scars that it has left behind in terms of skilling and education, etc., especially with school lockdowns and prolonged shutdowns and recourse to digital learning, will be an issue that we need to address because of the impact it will have on medium to long-term growth prospects.
Allow me to interrupt you, Dr. Nageswaran. What I'm asking actually is that we are constantly facing disruptions. You know, it began with technological disruption. Now there is COVID, and now there is war. And each of these, one was technological, the second was health, the third is geopolitical. And I believe now that this is going to be the new normal, in which case, does the economic thinking, the way we approach problems, the way we try to design policies, does that need to change? And if so, are you, as one of the prime thinkers for the governments, from the government side, part of this, is there some sort of a thought where crisis management becomes the new normal while education, health and other policies continue?
No, I think your point is well made. In fact, you said this is becoming the new normal. In fact, I was going to say that for this decade, unfortunately, we may need to get used to this situation being the norm than the exception, that we would face geopolitical crisis and a resetting of many things that we have taken for granted in the last 75 years. And to some extent, the survey alluded to this possibility as to how we managed the last 2 years. And that kind of flexible thinking has to be there in the sense that we need to have a longer term vision for the economy as to where we are heading, no doubt. But at the same time, situations are going to get thrown up, some on expected lines, but many on not so expected lines. We need to be prepared to take advantage in terms of being opportunistic about them. More importantly, both at the personal level and at the macro level, or even and thinking processes which have evolved over decades will also take time to be discarded. But that is the biggest challenge, more than the challenge of making policy. It is about having a mindset that is quick, agile, and open-minded enough to discard well-established and well-practiced conventions or approaches may need to be discarded, because this is a decade of inflection. And that is the most important requirement that conclaves such as this have to impress upon the audience. Back to you.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me then look inwards. We've seen the outer shocks and outer changes. Let me now try to look within. So the three sectors, which is agriculture, manufacturing and services. Services is doing well. The startup ecosystem is jumping. We had $1 billion valuation companies last year. The goal is to touch 100 such companies this year. So all that part is taken care of. Now, the problem areas are agriculture and manufacturing, and I'll come to them. The three farm laws, which I thought were extremely great for the small and marginal farmer, have been now repealed. What is the way forward if we want to increase farm productivity?
So, land consolidate. So the formulas were one element of the puzzle or the piece that is required, of the many pieces that are required to boost agricultural productivity. So consolidation of farmland is also an important element because the economic size, I do recall reading a OECD study some time ago that the economic size for a for a farmer to be viable is close to 4 hectares rather than less. And we know that 2/3 of the farm holdings in our country are less than 1 hectare, etc. So clearly, farm land consolidation is an important element. And second, of course, knowing what we are seeing with respect to salination of water tables and depletion of groundwater. Clearly, crop diversification and switching to other crops rather than concentrating on grains, especially in those selected country which rely a lot on grains. That's the second element. The third element would be to actually apply the procurement policy more widely across the country, because right now it is concentrated only on a few geographical locations. And the fourth and the important element of it is, which has been introduced in the last several years but has not probably made the deepest possible impact it should, is crop insurance, which is about planning for contingencies. That needs to be there. These elements would be important for raising farm productivity. Of course, the farm laws definitely were about giving choices to the farmers, and I don't think that the Prime Minister said that these are being withdrawn for good. I think from his remarks at the time when the farm laws were withdrawn, it appeared more like a tactical retreat. And this morning, I did see some news stories that some states are going ahead with the free movement of grains and allowing farmers to sell outside, etc. So, other than grains, this whole idea of farmers having a choice to sell through mandis or in the open market are already happening, whether with respect to dairy products or fruits and vegetables and flowers, etc. In many of these areas, what the formulas try to bring with respect to grains is already a reality. So I would think, based on what Jagdish Bhagwati said in India, that policy making is a 25-year marathon run in this country. Many things will happen when the inflection point comes. It is difficult to predict it, but I would think it's a matter of when and not if, when farmers get the choice to decide what to grow, at what price to sell, and whom to sell. Back to you.
Thank you. I'll shift to manufacturing then. In 1991, the Statement on Industrial Policy 1991, ushered in by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, ended the license Raj. However, the Inspector Raj continues. Today, and this applies more to manufacturing than to services, although it applies to services in a smaller form as well. So today, there are 69,233 compliances at an aggregate that that businesses need to conform to, of which 26,134 carry imprisonment clauses. I think we are trying to we are sending a message to our entrepreneurs that we don't want you. If at all you do something, there is a threat of putting you behind bars. But since nobody is behind bars, actually, this entire edifice is it's the foundation of what you and I call the rent-seeking society. I believe that if these compliance reforms come through, I don't know if you've been able to go through this report, Jailed for Doing Business. We released it 2 weeks ago. This would end the Inspector Raj. Just wanted to know your views, because I believe this is the last mile left. Everything else, technology, finance, markets, access, global, everything is there in place. It is just this last mile which prevents a small entrepreneur from becoming a middle or from expanding, because the moment he expands and enters the compliance universe, he has to look at 400 to 600 compliances every year.
I couldn't have put it better, Gautam, because your comment was more a comment, an observation than a question. And by the way, while I have not yet read fully the report and it's downloaded and it's in my inbox, I must compliment you and team leads for that wonderful report. It's very, very important. And I think, you said we economists call it the rent-seeking regime, but in order to give it a more, memorable acronym, I would call it the LIC Raj. License, inspection, compliance. So the Government of India is going ahead with the plans for an ITO of LIC. We need to divest from the LIC Raj, if not partially dilute its stake in the LIC, the company. So I think that is the key, and I completely agree with you. With not only the criminal provisions of some of these rules, but also the sheer fact of compliance. This is an indirect taxation. Because ultimately the amount of management bandwidth that is available with small and medium micro enterprises is already limited, and bulk of it is spent in compliance and inspection and managing the officials. And more importantly, your report pointed out, and I remember reading the executive summary, that two-thirds of these laws and rules and compliances rest with the state governments and local governments. And I think that is where the action lies. You said this is the last mile. I would say this is the first and the last mile, because everything else will be taken care of by the private sector once the government facilitates it. And what is required across all levels of government is an attitude of, we can't minimize type 1 and type 2 errors at the same time. In other words, we can't enable economic activity and at the same time want to ensure that every single rule, compliance and license is complied with and not a single person violates it. So we have to have a choice between the two. Right now, the approach is we will enable economic activity subject to enforcement. I would like to believe that it should change to one of enforcement subject to enabling economic activity, i.e. enabling economic activity should become the binding constraint or the binding principle at all levels of the government. And I think the reports such as yours with this dramatic title, etc., are going to be serving a very, very useful purpose. And I can't commend you enough for putting it out there, because that is the single most important challenge for raising our potential growth in the years ahead.
Thank you about that. So then we may be able to look forward to a chapter on this issue in the next economic survey. With that, I leave the last word to you in terms of where do you see the economy growing? And I'm not talking about quarter or next year, but by when are we reaching 5 trillion? By when are we looking at 10 trillion? By when are we looking at $20,000 per capita income?
Gautam, I thought I left behind all the forecasting when I left the private sector, and that was 10 years ago. It's interesting that the first topic that was given to me by the organizers about a month ago was India at 100, a new economic identity. And then the topic that has got changed closer to the date is state of the economy, good, bad, and the ugly. So that kind of tells you that people are getting caught up in the near-term challenges. So therefore, it is appropriate that you pose the question as where the economy is headed from the long-term point of view. For your young audience, I would say that they may not have noticed, given the exchange rate that we had in 21-22, the nominal GDP of India is around $3.2 trillion at the end of March 2022, which will be in about a few weeks from now. And then next year, of course, that is where any kind of assumption can be made given the recent developments. But assuming that the budget's assumption of 11% nominal GDP growth is quite realistic and has indeed somewhat, rather fortuitously incorporated some of these after developments in February, 11% or 12% can still be considered a realistic figure. So we will be heading towards $3.6 trillion of nominal GDP by the end of March 2023. Now, if we simply assume, given that the current situation will be the kind of environment that we will face in the rest of the decade, as we discussed earlier, and therefore, if we assume that 10% nominal GDP growth is a very, very conservative assumption. And we all know that the rule of 72 at 10%, your number doubles. So by the end of the decade, we should be at a nominal GDP of 7.2 trillion, and that is a lowball estimate, in my opinion, of nominal GDP. So, yes, there are multiple challenges, but it also throws up opportunities. For example, this year, the wheat exports from India will do very well given the rising wheat prices. And then this high oil prices is going to precipitate greater blending of ethanol into the fuel mix, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, etc. Yes, there will be an impact if the current oil price situation persists for a quarter or two. It will have an impact on the fiscal deficit, inflation. But going forward, I would think the Indian economic glass is more than half full. Because as you mentioned, we have done all the hard work. The financial sector has been cleaned up. Bank balance sheets are strong. Capital adequacy is high. The corporate sector has deleveraged and is poised to increase capacity utilization provided demand recovers. And demand is being held back because consumers are still worried by the pandemic clouds and the after effects of the last 2 years of impact. And of course, and therefore investment spending, employment generation, income growth is a virtuous cycle that needs to happen. We thought Omicron having been relatively milder, this would happen in the first quarter of the new financial year. But now, given this uncertain situation, it may get further pushed out. But in the medium term, I would think the biggest challenges to us realizing our full potential are only two areas. Education, skilling, I combine them into one, and then health. So National Family Health Survey number 5, which came out in November, pointed out that bulk of our population, adult population, is above the BMI of 25. So I think both the private sector and households, if they can proactively take care of health dimension of the public, of their own children, of their own families, and also educational institutions and state governments and students can make up for the last years of schooling and college in the last 2 years, then I think the damage to our potential growth will be quite limited going forward. And we can look ahead to a situation where the Indian economy is definitely a stronger one by the end of the decade. I don't want to get into the numbers of $20,000 per capita because sometimes numerical targets may make us pursue short-term policies, and sometimes too much of debt will be what is required to achieve those kinds of numerical targets. We need to have a level of GDP and per capita income that allows all Indians a life of dignity and reasonable standard of living. That is what we should be aiming for with sustainable balance sheets, both at the households and at the firm level. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. And in your concluding remarks, I'm delighted to hear that at 7 trillion, India will be the world's third largest economy within this decade. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.